Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 6 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 6. Question number 199. An internal deployment tool publishes new Lambda versions. Production clients invoke a stable alias, and the company wants the alias to initially send a fixed percentage of requests to the new version. Which configuration provides this traffic split? Option A. Put the percentage in a Lambda environment variable. Option B. Configure a weighted routing configuration on the Lambda alias. Option C. Select a code deploy linear deployment without integrating code deploy into the internal tool. Option D. Select a code deploy canary deployment without integrating code deploy into the internal tool. The correct answer is B. Configure a weighted routing configuration on the Lambda alias. Here is why. A weighted alias can split invocations between the primary version and one additional version using a fixed percentage. Why are the other options not correct? Environment variables do not control Lambda version routing. C. A code deploy deployment type requires integration with code deploy, rather than only the existing internal tool. D. The same integration issue applies to canary deployment configuration. Exam tip. Use alias routing config for a direct two-version percentage split. Use code deploy when the shift must be automated over time. Question number 200. An RDS-backed application experiences unpredictable surges of read traffic. The team wants a simple, horizontally scalable, multi-threaded in-memory cache to reduce database reads. Advanced REST data structures and persistence are not required. Which solution has the least complexity? Option A. Add a DAX cluster after replicating all data to DynamoDB. Option B. Use Elastic Cache for REST OSS. Option C. Read from the standby instance of an RDS multi-availability zone deployment. Option D. Use Elastic Cache for Memcached. The correct answer is D. Use Elastic Cache for Memcached. Here is why. Memcached is a simple multi-threaded, horizontally scalable cache suited to distributing transient database query results across nodes. Why are the other options not correct? A moving data to DynamoDB and DAX is an unnecessary database redesign. B. REST OSS provides richer data structures and availability features, but does not match the stated simple multi-threaded cache requirement as directly. C. An RDS multi-availability zone standby is not available for read traffic. Exam tip. Choose Memcached for simple multi-threaded scale-out caching. Choose REST OSS or Valkey for richer data structures, replication, and persistence. Question number 201. A scheduled Lambda function needs a third-party API key. The key must be stored in the function configuration and encrypted at rest with a customer-controlled KMS key. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Store the key in the function source code. Option B. Configure the API key as a Lambda environment variable encrypted with a customer-managed KMS key. Option C. Prompt an interactive user for the key during the function's first invocation. Option D. Move the function to Lambda at edge and rely only on HTTPS. The correct answer is B. Configure the API key as a Lambda environment variable encrypted with a customer-managed KMS key. Here is why. Lambda encrypts environment variables at rest, and a customer-managed KMS key provides customer-controlled key policy and usage permissions. Why are the other options not correct? A source code is not an appropriate secret store. C. Scheduled Lambda invocations cannot depend on interactive input. D. HTTPS protects data in transit and does not encrypt the configured API key at rest. Exam tip. Lambda environment variables can use a customer-managed KMS key, but use Secrets Manager when rotation or centralized secret management is required. Question number 202. Sensitive images are infrequently accessed during their first year and are archived. Afterward, the company requires multi-availability zone resiliency and must restore an archived image within 24 hours at the lowest cost. Which storage and retrieval combination meets the requirement? Option A, S3 1 Zone IA followed by S3 Glacier Deep Archive with bulk retrieval. Option B, S3 Standard IA followed by S3 Glacier Deep Archive with standard retrieval. Option C, S3 Standard IA followed by S3 Glacier Deep Archive with bulk retrieval. Option D, S3 Intelligent Tiering followed by Deep Archive with standard retrieval. The correct answer is B, S3 Standard IA followed by S3 Glacier Deep Archive with standard retrieval. Here is why. Standard IA stores data redundantly across multiple availability zones, and Deep Archive standard retrieval typically restores objects within 12 hours. Why are the other options not correct? A one-zone IA does not meet the maximum resiliency requirement, and Deep Archive bulk retrieval can take up to 48 hours. C. Bulk retrieval does not satisfy the 24-hour recovery requirement. D. Intelligent tiering adds monitoring charges when the access and lifecycle pattern is already known. Exam tip. Deep Archive standard retrieval is typically within 12 hours. Bulk retrieval can take up to 48 hours. Question number 203. A SAM application will be deployed to development, QA, and staging with different stack names and parameters. The developer wants one configuration file that stores named environment settings and avoids maintaining multiple templates or long parameter lists. Which solution requires the least development effort? Option A. Create a separate SAM template in shell script for every environment. Option B. Put only default values in one configuration file and manually pass every override on each deployment. Option C. Add named environment tables to samconfig.toml and deploy with sam deploy. Config env for the selected environment. Option D. Add resource parameters to the template, but do not store deployment settings for each environment. The correct answer is C. Add named environment tables to samconfig.toml and deploy with sam deploy. Config env for the selected environment. Here is why. One SAM configuration file can contain multiple named environments, and config env selects the appropriate saved deployment settings. Why are the other options not correct? A. Separate templates and scripts duplicate application configuration. B. Repeated manual overrides create more deployment effort and inconsistency. D. Template parameters alone do not preserve environment-specific SAM CLI deployment settings. Exam tip. Store named SAM environments in samconfig.toml and select them with config env. Question number 204. IoT devices upload hourly data files to an S3 bucket. A Lambda function must begin processing immediately after every successful object upload. Which configuration directly connects the event source to the function? Option A. Add the S3 bucket as a Lambda trigger for object-created events. Option B. Add the S3 bucket as a Lambda layer. Option C. Configure only Lambda asynchronous invocation settings and select S3 as the source. Option D. Add an event bridge event to the function without enabling or defining S3 event delivery. The correct answer is A. Add the S3 bucket as a Lambda trigger for object-created events. Here is why. The trigger configures an S3 event notification and the Lambda resource-based permission required for S3 to invoke the function after uploads. Why are the other options not correct? B. Layers package shared code and dependencies. C. Lambda asynchronous settings control processing after invocation, not the S3 event source. D. Event bridge can route S3 events only when S3 event bridge delivery and a matching rule are configured. Exam tip. Use an S3 object-created trigger for direct S3 to Lambda invocation. Question number 205. A developer creates and updates cloud formation stacks through the AWS CLI. Resource. Provisioning fails. Resources that were successfully provisioned during that operation must remain available for troubleshooting instead of being rolled back. Which CLI option should be supplied to create stack and update stack? Option A. Enable termination protection. Option B. Tags key equals preserve resources value equals true. Option C. Disable rollback. Option D. Parameters parameter key equals preserve resources, parameter value equals true. The correct answer is C. Disable rollback. Here is why. The option preserves the state of successfully provisioned resources when a create or update stack operation fails, allowing troubleshooting and retry. Why are the other options not correct? A termination protection prevents explicit stack deletion, not failure rollback. B. Tags do not change rollback behavior. D. A custom parameter affects rollback only if the template contains custom logic for it. Exam tip. Use disable rollback to preserve provisioned resources after a failed CloudFormation operation. Question number 206. Hundreds of Lambda functions connect to Aurora PostgreSQL. Each scale-out event can create additional database connections, but the functions must retain unrestricted application scalability while reducing connection pressure. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Set reserved concurrency to 10 for every function. Option B. Create an RDS proxy connection pool and update each function to use the proxy endpoint. Option C. Enable Aurora Cluster Cache Management and use it as a database connection endpoint. Option D. Set provision concurrency to 10 for every function. The correct answer is B. Create an RDS proxy connection pool and update each function to use the proxy endpoint. Here is why. RDS proxy multiplexes and reuses database connections, while Lambda functions continue scaling independently. Why are the other options not correct? Reserved concurrency caps function scalability, rather than pooling connections. C. Aurora Cluster Cache Management concerns buffer cache behavior, not client connection pooling. D. Provision concurrency reduces cold starts but does not cap or pool database connections. Exam tip. RDS proxy decouples Lambda concurrency from the number of physical database connections. Question number 207. A team is starting development of a major new application version, while the currently released version still requires production bug fixes. Both lines of work are stored in one code commit repository. Which branching approach supports the two work streams? Option A. Create one branch from the current main line for maintenance fixes and another branch for development of the new version. Option B. Create two Git tags and use them as writable development branches. Option C. Create only a protected copy of the production branch and do not create a branch for the new version. Option D. Create a second repository solely because two active versions exist. The correct answer is A. Create one branch from the current main line for maintenance fixes and another branch for development of the new version. Here is why. Separate branches allow ongoing production maintenance and next version development to progress independently while sharing one repository. Why are the other options not correct? B. Git tags identify fixed commits and are not normal writable development lines. C. It provides no branch for the new version work. D. Separate repositories add unnecessary synchronization and administration. Exam tip. Use long-lived or feature branches when multiple supported versions require parallel changes. Question number 208. A CloudFormation template defines IAM roles and policies with explicit custom names. Stack creation fails with insufficient capabilities. Which acknowledgement must the developer provide? Option A. Capability underfront. Option B. Capability underfront expand. Option C. Capability underfront. Option D. An administrator role instead of a capabilities acknowledgement. The correct answer is C. Capability underfront. Here is why. CloudFormation requires capability underfront when a template creates or modifies IAM resources that specify custom names. Why are the other options not correct? A. Capability underfront applies when IAM resources do not require acknowledgement of custom names. B. Capability for expand acknowledges macros and nested applications. D. Administrator permissions do not replace the required capabilities declaration. Exam tip. Use capability for explicitly named IAM resources and capability for unnamed IAM resources. Question number 209. An API gateway REST API uses stage caching. Authorized test clients need to bypass and refresh an individual cached response when issuing a request. Which configuration enables this capability? Option A. Grant execute API. Invalidate cache to the clients and have them send. Cache control. Max age equals 0 with the API request. Option B. Tell clients to call an API gateway management operation named invalidate cache. Option C. Add an invalidate for cache query parameter without granting any cache invalidation permission. Option D. Use the API Gateway SDK Management Client to invoke an invalidate cache operation. The correct answer is A. Grant execute API. Invalidate cache to the clients and have them send cache control. Max age equals 0 with the API request. Here is why. An authorized request with cache control. Max age equals 0 bypasses the cached entry, fetches the integration response, and replaces that cache entry. Why are the other options not correct? B. API gateway does not expose the described client management operation named invalidate cache for individual entries. C. The query parameter is not the cache invalidation protocol and lacks authorization. D. The SDK management client is not how callers refresh an individual cached API response. Exam tip. API gateway clients invalidate an entry with cache control. Max age equals 0 and execute API. Invalidate cache permission when authorization is required. Question number 210. A globally accessed website runs dynamic code on an autoscaling group, but users experience high latency when downloading static assets from the EC2 instances. The solution should reduce global static content latency and remove those files from the web servers. Which two changes should the developer make? Choose 2. Option A. Increase the autoscaling group's maximum capacity. Option B. Move all dynamic application code to Lambda. Option C. Store the static assets in Amazon S3. Option D. Increase the EC2 instance size. E. Place an Amazon CloudFront distribution in front of the static content origin. The correct answer is C. Store the static assets in Amazon S3. E. Place an Amazon CloudFront distribution in front of the static content origin. Here is why. S3 provides durable object storage, and CloudFront caches the assets at edge locations near global users, reducing latency and EC2 load. Why are the other options not correct? A. More origin instances do not provide global edge caching. B. Moving dynamic code to Lambda is unrelated to static asset delivery. D. Larger instances do not shorten network distance to worldwide users. Exam tip. Offload static files to S3 and deliver them globally through CloudFront. Question number 211. A serverless API is defined with AWS SAM. For each release, 10% of requests must reach the new Lambda version for 10 minutes. If validation succeeds, the remaining traffic must move to the new version automatically. Which SAM function configuration provides this rollout? Option A. Set deployment preference to linear 10% every 10 minutes and configure pre-traffic and post-traffic with the alias name. Option B. Set deployment preference to canary 10% 10 minutes and configure pre-traffic and post-traffic with the alias name. Option C. Set deployment preference to canary 10% 10 minutes and specify auto-publish alias for the function. Option D. Set deployment preference to linear 10% every 10 minutes and specify auto-publish alias for the function. The correct answer is C. Set deployment preference to canary 10% 10 minutes and specify auto-publish alias for the function. Here is why. Auto-publish alias creates a stable alias for published versions, and the canary preference sends 10% of traffic first before shifting the remaining 90% after 10 minutes. Why are the other options not correct? A. Linear shifts another 10% every interval, rather than completing after one canary period. B. Pre-traffic and post-traffic require hook functions, not an alias value. D. It uses the wrong linear rollout behavior. Exam tip. SAM gradual deployments require auto-publish alias plus a deployment preference such as canary 10% 10 minutes. Question number 212. A Lambda function calculates operational statistics and writes the results to DynamoDB. The function must run every 15 minutes with no servers and minimal development effort. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Run a systems manager run command shell script on EC2 every 15 minutes. Option B. Create an event bridge scheduled rule with a 15-minute rate expression and set the function as the target. Option C. Maintain a small EC2 instance with a cron entry that invokes the function. Option D. Build a continuously running step function's execution that invokes the function after each wait state. The correct answer is B. Create an event bridge scheduled rule with a 15-minute rate expression and set the function as the target. Here is why. Event bridge invokes Lambda on a recurring serverless schedule without an instance or a continuously running workflow. Why are the other options not correct? A run command still requires managed EC2 compute and additional scripting. C. EC2 cron introduces server operations and idle cost. D. A long-running state machine adds unnecessary workflow complexity. Exam tip. Use Event Bridge Scheduler or a scheduled rule for recurring Lambda invocations. Question number 213. A Lambda invocation creates approximately 100 megabytes of intermediate files. The files are needed only while that invocation prepares the final export and can be discarded afterward. Where should the function place the temporary files? Option A. In the function/tmp directory. Option B. On an EFS file system that the function deletes after completion. Option C. In an S3 bucket with a lifecycle expiration rule. Option D. On an EBS volume attached to the function. The correct answer is A. In the function/tmp directory. Here is why. Lambda provides encrypted ephemeral/tmp storage for files needed only during execution, and 100 megabytes is within its configurable storage capacity. Why are the other options not correct? BEFS is persistent shared storage and adds VPC and file system overhead. C. S3 is durable object storage and lifecycle expiration is unnecessary for execution scratch files. DBS volumes cannot be attached directly to Lambda functions. Exam tip. Use /tmp for invocation local temporary data, and EFS for persistent shared file access. Question number 214. A Lambda consumer processes DynamoDB stream records for an order table and writes structured order details to its log group. Operations needs a CloudWatch dashboard that shows the daily count of distinct customers whose order quantity was 0. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A. Create an event bridge rule that aggregates distinct customers and sends a dashboard as its target. Option B. Query CloudTrail API events with Athena and add the query directly to a CloudWatch dashboard. Option C. Enable a custom metric on the DynamoDB stream and configure an alarm to calculate distinct customers. Option D. Ensure the function can write to CloudWatch logs, create a logs insights query that counts distinct affected customers in one-day bins, and add the query widget to the dashboard. The correct answer is D. Ensure the function can write to CloudWatch logs, create a logs insights query that counts distinct affected customers in one-day bins, and add the query widget to the dashboard. Here is why. Structured Lambda logs contain the order fields. Logs insights can filter quantity 0 and calculate distinct customers by day, and dashboards support query widgets. Why are the other options not correct? A. Event bridge rules route events but do not perform daily distinct count aggregation. B. CloudTrail records AWS API activity, not the application's order quantities. C. DynamoDB stream metrics do not contain customer-level business attributes. Exam tip. Use logs insights for ad hoc aggregation of structured application log fields, and add saved queries to CloudWatch dashboards. Question number 215. A Lambda function uses a DynamoDB item's primary key to read the item, modify attributes, and write a new item when the key does not already exist. Which set of IAM actions supports these operations? Option A. DynamoDB get records, DynamoDB put item, and DynamoDB update table. Option B. DynamoDB get item, DynamoDB update item, and DynamoDB put item. Option C. DynamoDB get item, DynamoDB delete item, and DynamoDB put item. Option D. DynamoDB get item, DynamoDB update item, and DynamoDB describe table. The correct answer is B. DynamoDB get item, DynamoDB update item, and DynamoDB put item. Here is why. Get item retrieves the record, update item modifies attributes, and put item supports the application's explicit create path when the record is absent. Why are the other options not correct? A get records reads DynamoDB streams and update table changes table configuration. C. Delete item is unnecessary and the set lacks update item. D. Describe table does not create an item, and the set lacks put item for the stated create path. Exam tip. Grant DynamoDB actions that match the application's item-level API operations, not table administration or stream APIs. Question number 216. An EC2 application previously used an IAM, user's access keys from environment variables. The instance now has an IAM role with equivalent DynamoDB permissions, and the IAM user was deleted. After restart, the application still receives access denied, although a WSCLI commands run under another configured profile succeed. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The SDK cannot obtain credentials from an EC2 instance profile. Option B. The instance security group is blocking access to the instance metadata address. Option C. The deleted user's environment variable credentials still take precedence in the SDK credential provider chain. Option D. The role policy has not propagated because IAM policies always require an extended delay. The correct answer is C. The deleted user's environment variable credentials still take precedence in the SDK credential provider chain. Here is why. Explicit access key environment variables are checked before EC2 instance profile credentials, so stale deleted user keys can prevent the SDK from using the role. Why are the other options not correct? AWS SDKs support temporary credentials from instance profiles. B. Security groups do not filter access to the link local instance metadata endpoint in the stated manner. D. A persistent access denied after restart is better explained by the selected credential source than ordinary IAM propagation. Exam tip. Remove obsolete AWS values when migrating EC2 applications to instance roles. Question number 217. An application runs in two regions in an active-passive disaster recovery design. Database. Credentials must be removed from source code, encrypted, and available locally in the standby region during failover. Which solution is most secure? Option A. Put a plaintext configuration file on EFS and use regional file system endpoints from both regions. Option B. Store the credentials in a configuration file in S3 and replicate the object to another region. Option C. Store the credentials in parameter store and enable a native cross-region parameter replication feature. Option D. Store the credentials in secrets manager in the primary region, replicate the secret to the standby region, and retrieve the regional secret from the application. The correct answer is D. Store the credentials in Secrets Manager in the primary region, replicate the secret to the standby region, and retrieve the regional secret from the application. Here is why. Secrets Manager encrypts the credential and replicates its data and metadata to selected regions for regional disaster recovery access. Why are the other options not correct? EFS is regional and does not provide one cross-region file system. B. An encrypted secret service is more appropriate than a replicated configuration file. C. Parameter store does not provide the stated native cross-region parameter replication. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager multi-region replication when applications require regional copies of credentials for failover. Question number 218. An application intermittently receives CloudWatch throttling exception responses and gets no data from those failed requests. Which practice should the developer apply first? Option A. Retry throttled calls by using exponential backoff and jitter. Option B. Remove the CloudWatch API call from the application. Option C. Replace the SDK call with an AWS CLI process. Option D. Immediately request a service quota increase without implementing retries. The correct answer is A. Retry throttled calls by using exponential backoff and jitter. Here is why. Throttling is commonly transient. Progressively delayed retries reduce contention and allow service capacity to become available. Why are the other options not correct? B. Removing a required API call does not solve resilient error handling. C. The CLI is subject to the same API throttling controls. D. A quota increase may be considered later, but retry behavior is the first application best practice. Exam tip. Use SDK retry modes or exponential backoff with jitter for retryable throttling errors. Question number 219. After an application was placed behind an application load balancer, every request appears to originate from a load balancer address. The application must continue scaling across multiple targets and must determine the original client address. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Replace the ALB with a classic load balancer. Option B. Update the application to parse the X forwarded for header and correctly handle a list of addresses. Option C. Require every client to provide its own IP address in a custom header. Option D. Remove the load balancer and route all traffic to one EC2 instance. The correct answer is B. Update the application to parse the X forwarded for header and correctly handle a list of addresses. Here is why. An ALB appends client address information to X forwarded for, preserving the original IP while allowing the target fleet to scale horizontally. Why are the other options not correct? A classic load balancer is unnecessary and does not improve the application logic. C. Client-supplied custom headers can be spoofed and require client changes. D. Removing the load balancer eliminates horizontal scaling and availability. Exam tip. Treat X forwarded for as a comma-separated chain and apply the application's trusted proxy rules. Question number 220. Clickstream records can remain in a Kinesis data stream for up to 12 hours before consumers process them. The records must be encrypted while retained by the stream. Which feature should the developer enable? Option A. The Kinesis client library. Option B. TLS connections only. Option C. Kinesis data stream server-side encryption. Option D. A Lambda function that encrypts records after they have been stored. The correct answer is C. Kinesis data stream server-side encryption. Here is why. Server-side encryption encrypts stream records at rest while Kinesis retains them, using an AWS managed or customer managed KMS key. Why are the other options not correct? A. The client library helps consumers process records and does not encrypt stream storage. B. TLS protects records in transit only. D. Encrypting after storage leaves the retained stream data unprotected before the function runs. Exam tip. Use TLS for Kinesis data in transit and stream server-side encryption for data at rest. Question number 221. An API receives millions of events that must be processed in near real time by multiple independent consumers. Consumers must read the same stream concurrently without creating a separate queue for every application. Which service is the best fit? Option A. Amazon Kinesis data streams. Option B. Amazon Data Firehose. Option C. An SNS FIFO topic with an SQS FIFO queue for every consumer. Option D. An SNS standard topic with an SQS standard queue for every consumer. The correct answer is A. Amazon Kinesis data streams. Here is why. Kinesis data streams supports high-throughput real-time ingestion and allows multiple consumer applications to read the same ordered stream concurrently. Why are the other options not correct? B. Data Firehose delivers data to configured destinations and is not a general multi-consumer stream. C. FIFO fanout requires a separate queue for each consumer and adds ordering constraints not stated. D. Standard SNS to SQS fanout works for discrete subscribers, but requires one queue per consumer, and is less direct for the stated streaming workload. Exam tip. Use Kinesis data streams when multiple applications need independent real-time consumption from one high-volume stream. Question number 222. A team wants infrastructure definitions under version control. It must deploy repeatable copies, review stage changes, and revert the definitions to an earlier version. Which combination meets these requirements? Option A. Elastic Beanstalk and code commit. Option B. CloudFormation and code commit. Option C. CloudWatch alarms and resource tags. Option D. Cost allocation reports and OpsWorks. The correct answer is B. CloudFormation and code commit. Here is why. CloudFormation defines repeatable infrastructure, while a Git repository such as code commit versions templates and supports review, staging, and rollback to earlier commits. Why are the other options not correct? Elastic Beanstalk manages application environments, but is not a general infrastructure template system. C. Metrics and tags do not deploy version infrastructure. D. Cost reports and OpsWorks do not provide the requested template version workflow. Exam tip. Store infrastructure as code templates in version control, and deploy them through CloudFormation. Question number 223. A deployment script must create a new EC2 instance from an AMI by using the AWS CLI. Which command should the script run? Option A. AWS EC2 start instances. Option B. AWS EC2 bundle instance. Option C. AWS EC2 run instances. Option D. AWS EC2 confirm product instance. The correct answer is C. AWS EC2 run instances. Here is why. Run instances launches one or more new EC2 instances from an AMI and the specified instance configuration. Why are the other options not correct? Start instances starts existing stopped instances. B. Bundle instance is an obsolete image bundling workflow, not instance launch. D. Confirm product instance verifies marketplace product code association. Exam tip. Use run instances to create EC2 instances and start instances only for existing stopped instances. Question number 224. A company needs to give workshop attendees access to private S3 reference documents for exactly 7 days. The external attendees do not have AWS identities. Which sharing method is most secure? Option A. Create temporary IAM users and send their access keys to attendees. Option B. Share the ARN of an IAM role that can read the bucket. Option C. Copy the documents to a broadly shared collaboration folder. Option D. Generate S3 pre-signed URLs with a 7-day expiration. The correct answer is D. Generate S3 pre-signed URLs with a 7-day expiration. Here is why. Pre-signed URLs grant time-limited access to specific private objects without creating AWS identities or exposing credentials to attendees. Why are the other options not correct? A shared IAM access keys create long-term credential and revocation risk. B. A role ARN alone does not let unauthenticated external users assume the role. C. Moving content to another service is unnecessary and may broaden access. Exam tip. Use pre-signed URLs for temporary access to individual private S3 objects. Question number 225. A VPC-connected Lambda function cannot reach an RDS for SQL Server instance in a private subnet on TCP port 1433. The developer must verify both network access and the permissions. Lambda needs to manage its VPC network interfaces. Which two checks are relevant? Choose 2. Option A. Confirm that the function security group allows inbound 1433 from the database and that the database security group allows outbound 1433 to the function. Option B. Confirm outbound TCP 1433 from the function security group to the database security group and inbound TCP 1433 on the database security group from the function security group. Option C. Make the database publicly accessible and add a NAT gateway. Option D. Confirm that the function execution role permits EC2. Create network interface. EC2. Describe network interfaces and EC2. Delete network interface. E. Grant RDS. Modify DB instance and RDS. Describe DB security groups to the execution role. The correct answer is B. Confirm outbound TCP 1433 from the function security group to the database security group and inbound TCP 1433 on the database security group from the function security group. D. Confirm that the function execution role permits EC2. Create network interface, EC2. Describe network interfaces and EC2. Delete network interface. Here is why. The security group path permits SQL Server traffic, and the EC2 permissions allow Lambda to create and manage the network interfaces used for VPC connectivity. Why are the other options not correct? The connection is initiated by Lambda, so the directions are reversed. C. Private Lambda to RDS connectivity does not require public database access or NAT. E. Describing or modifying RDS resources is not required for the application TCP connection. Exam tip. Troubleshoot VPC Lambda database access by checking ENI permissions, subnet routing, and security group direction. Question number 226. A product service writes updated prices to DynamoDB and reads product listings through Elastic Cache. Sellers report that a listing sometimes continues showing the old price after the table update succeeds. What is the most likely cause? Option A. DynamoDB has insufficient write capacity. Option B. DynamoDB has insufficient read capacity. Option C. The application does not invalidate or update the cached item when its price changes. Option D. The cache uses a write-through strategy. The correct answer is C. The application does not invalidate or update the cached item when its price changes. Here is why. A stale cache entry continues to serve the old value even though DynamoDB contains the successful update. Why are the other options not correct? A. Insufficient write capacity would throttle or fail the table update rather than produce a successfully updated table with a stale listing. B. Read throttling does not explain a consistently old cached value. D. A correctly implemented write-through strategy updates the cache during the write. Exam tip. Define cache invalidation or write-through behavior whenever source data changes frequently. Question number 227. An application on EC2 uploads files to a specific S3 bucket. The design must avoid long-term access keys and grant only the S3 API operations the application requires. Which configuration is most secure? Option A. Create an IAM role with least privilege S3 permissions and attach it to the EC2 instance through an instance profile. Option B. Create an IAM role and store an access key for the role in environment variables. Option C. Grant the EC2 instance ID access in an S3 bucket policy. Option D. Create an IAM user and store its access key in environment variables. The correct answer is A. Create an IAM role with least privilege S3 permissions and attach it to the EC2 instance through an instance profile. Here is why. The instance profile supplies automatically rotated temporary credentials, and the role policy can be limited to the required S3 actions and resources. Why are the other options not correct? B. IAM roles do not have long-term access keys to store in environment variables. C. S3 policies authorize IAM principals rather than an EC2 instance ID. D. IAM user keys are long-lived and require secure storage and rotation. Exam tip. Use EC2 instance profiles instead of embedded access keys for application access to AWS services. Question number 228. A Lambda function in a shared services account must call EC2. Describe instances in several development accounts. The permissions must follow least privilege. Which cross-account configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Grant EC2. Describe instances directly to the shared account execution role for resources in every development account. Option B. Create a role in each development account with EC2. Describe instances trust the shared Lambda execution role and allow that execution role to call STS. Assume role on the development roles. Option C. Create the role in the shared account and make the development accounts assume it. Option D. Grant EC2. Describe instances to both the shared execution role and every development account root principal. The correct answer is B. Create a role in each development account with EC2. Describe instances, trust the shared Lambda execution role, and allow that execution role to call STS. Assume role on the development roles. Here is why. The target account role grants the EC2 permission. An STS role assumption provides temporary cross-account credentials with least privilege. Why are the other options not correct? A. A shared account role cannot directly authorize another account's resources. C. The role belongs in the target account. D. Direct EC2 permission on the source role does not establish cross-account access. Exam tip. Cross-account access needs target role trust plus STS. Assume role permission for the caller. Question number 229. A ticketing API receives competing requests for the same seat. The first request must reserve the seat, payment must run only for the active reservation, and a failed payment must release the reservation so the next request can proceed. Which design best coordinates the workflow? Option A. Publish every request to a standard SNS topic and invoke inventory and payment in parallel. Option B. Put requests in one standard SQS and let inventory and payment functions compete for the same message. Option C. Use a step functions workflow that performs a conditional seat reservation, invokes payment only after reservation succeeds, and releases the reservation on payment failure. Option D. Fan out each request through an SNS FIFO topic to separate inventory and payment queues that process independently. The correct answer is C. Use a step functions workflow that performs a conditional seat reservation, invokes payment only after reservation succeeds, and releases the reservation on payment failure. Here is why. The workflow serializes the business steps, uses atomic reservation logic, and provides compensation before the next waiting request proceeds. Why are the other options not correct? A and D. Independent fan-out can run payment without a valid reservation. B. Competing consumers do not coordinate the two required steps. Exam tip. Use orchestration and conditional rights when a workflow requires reservation, payment, and compensation. Question number 230. An application records custom business attributes in X-ray trace segments. Users need to search a large trace collection by those attributes with X-ray filter expressions. How should the attributes be recorded? Option A. As metadata in each segment. Option B. As arbitrary new top-level segment document fields. Option C. As values in X-ray sampling rules. Option D. As annotations in each segment. The correct answer is D. As annotations in each segment. Here is why. X-ray indexes annotations and makes their keys and values available in filter expressions. Why are the other options not correct? A metadata is recorded, but is not indexed for trace filtering. B. Arbitrary segment fields are not the supported custom searchable attribute mechanism. C. Sampling rules determine which requests are traced and do not store per trace business attributes. Exam tip. Use X-ray annotations for indexed search fields and metadata for non-indexed diagnostic details. Question number 231. A REST API has development, test, and production environments. The team wants the fewest API gateway and Lambda resources while keeping stable environment-specific endpoints and immutable function targets. Which design should be used? Option A. Deploy each environment to a different region. Option B. Use one API gateway API with separate stages and one Lambda function with aliases for the environments. Option C. Create a separate API and function for every environment. Option D. Use one API stage and require clients to pass the environment in a request parameter. The correct answer is B. Use one API gateway API with separate stages and one Lambda function with aliases for the environments. Here is why. API stages provide distinct endpoints, and Lambda aliases provide stable environment-specific references to published versions while minimizing duplicate resources. Why are the other options not correct? A. Separate regions add unnecessary resources and operational complexity. C. Separate APIs and functions multiply resources to maintain. D. A client parameter does not provide isolated deployment stages and exposes environment routing to callers. Exam tip. Pair API gateway stages with Lambda aliases for compact multi-environment serverless deployments. Question number 232. An application writes to a DynamoDB table in provision capacity mode and receives provision throughput exceeded exception during unpredictable bursts. The team wants to reduce throttling without changing the EC2 instance size. Which two actions address the issue? Choose two. Option A. Add exponential backoff so the application reduces its request rate after throttling. Option B. Increase the table's read capacity units even though the failing operation is a write. Option C. Decrease retry delays so the application sends requests more frequently. Option D. Change the table from provision capacity mode to on-demand capacity mode. E. Move the application to a larger EC2 instance. The correct answer is A. Add exponential backoff so the application reduces its request rate after throttling. D. Change the table from provisioned capacity mode to on-demand capacity mode. Here is why. Backoff prevents immediate repeated throttling, and on-demand capacity automatically accommodates unpredictable request bursts without manually sizing throughput. Why are the other options not correct? B. The application performs writes, so additional RCUs do not address the throttled operation. C. Shorter delays increase pressure during throttling. EC2 size does not change DynamoDB table capacity. Exam tip. Match DynamoDB capacity mode to traffic predictability, and always handle throttling with backoff. Question number 233. Given the following AWS CloudFormation template. Description. Creates a new Amazon S3 bucket for shared content. Uses a random bucket name to avoid conflicts. Resources. Content bucket. 2:53. Bucket. Type. AWS. Outputs. Content bucket name. Value. Ref content bucket. What is the most efficient way to reference the new Amazon S3 bucket from another AWS CloudFormation template? Option A. Add an export declaration to the output section of the original template, and use import value in other templates. Option B. Add exported, true to the content bucket in the original template and use import resource in other templates. Option C. Create a custom AWS CloudFormation resource that gets the bucket name from the content bucket resource of the first stack. Option D. Use FN. Include the existing template in other templates and use the content bucket resource directly. The correct answer is A. Add an export declaration to the output section of the original template, and use import value in other templates. Here is why. Ref content bucket returns the generated S3 bucket name. Exporting that output makes it available to another CloudFormation stack, which can retrieve it with FN, import value. This is CloudFormation's native cross-stack reference mechanism. Why are the other options not correct? B. Exported, true and import resource are not valid CloudFormation features. C. A custom resource would add unnecessary Lambda code and operational complexity. D. FN. Include inserts template fragments. It does not reference a resource already created by another stack. Exam tip. Use outputs with export in FN. Import value for cross-stack references within the same AWS account and region. Question number 234. A Lambda function was successfully registered in an application load balancer target group through the AWS CLI. Requests reach the listener, but the function is never invoked. Which missing configuration is the likely cause? Option A. Enable cross-zone load balancing. Option B. Add a Lambda resource-based permission that allows the Elastic Load Balancing service to invoke the function. Option C. Register the function again through the AWS Management Console. Option D. Replace the Lambda target because ALB target groups do not support functions. The correct answer is B. Add a Lambda resource-based permission that allows the Elastic Load Balancing service to invoke the function. Here is why. Registering the function does not by itself grant invocation permission. The function policy must allow Elastic Load Balancing, Amazon AWS, to invoke it for the target group. Why are the other options not correct? A. Cross-zone behavior is unrelated to Lambda invoke authorization. C. Lambda targets can be registered through the CLI. D. Application load balancers support Lambda target groups. Exam tip. Push-based Lambda integrations require a function resource policy that permits the invoking service. Question number 235. A Lambda function connects to our DS for MySQL. The database credential must be encrypted, centrally stored and rotated automatically. Which solution meets the requirements? Option A. Store the value in XAMPP security token and configure token rotation. Option B. Store the credential as Lambda environment variables and enable automatic environment variable rotation. Option C. Store the credential in Secrets Manager and configure managed rotation. Option D. Store the credential as parameter store secure string values and enable native managed database rotation. The correct answer is C. Store the credential in Secrets Manager and configure managed rotation. Here is why. Secrets Manager encrypts database credentials and provides supported managed rotation strategies for our DS secrets. Why are the other options not correct? A XAMPP security token carries temporary AWS session credentials and is not a secret store. B. Lambda environment variables do not automatically rotate database passwords. D. Parameter store does not provide native managed database credential rotation. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager when encrypted database credentials must rotate automatically. Question number 236. A developer has published an updated Lambda version and wants one stable invocation target to split requests between the current version and the candidate version. Which configuration provides the split? Option A. Create a Lambda alias and configure weighted routing between the two published versions. Option B. Configure Route 53 weighted records for the two function versions. Option C. Package the new version as a Lambda layer and route requests between layers. Option D. Register both versions as separate ALB targets and use target weights. The correct answer is A. Create a Lambda alias and configure weighted routing between the two published versions. Here is why. A Lambda alias can route a configured percentage of invocations to one additional published version, while retaining a stable ARN. Why are the other options not correct? B. Route 53 routes DNS endpoints and does not target Lambda versions directly. C. Layers package dependencies and are not deployable function versions. D. ALB target groups do not provide Lambda alias-style version weights. Exam tip. Use weighted aliases for direct traffic splitting between two Lambda versions. Question number 237. Lambda pulls an SQS queue and calls a third-party API. Increased queue traffic causes the function to exceed the provider's documented rate limit and receive HTTP 429 responses. Which configuration directly limits the number of concurrent calls generated by this event source? Option A. Increase the SQS batch size. Option B. Increase the maximum event age and retry attempts for asynchronous Lambda invocations. Option C. Configure provision concurrency to match the API rate limit. Option D. Set maximum concurrency on the SQS event source mapping based on the provider's limit. The correct answer is D. Set maximum concurrency on the SQS event source mapping based on the provider's limit. Here is why. Event source maximum concurrency caps how many Lambda invocations that queue can generate, directly limiting simultaneous third-party API calls. Why are the other options not correct? A larger batch can increase work per invocation and does not directly enforce the provider's concurrency limit. B. SQS event source mappings do not use the function's asynchronous maximum event age configuration. C. Provision concurrency pre-initializes environments but does not cap invocation concurrency. Exam tip. Use SQS event source maximum concurrency to protect downstream systems from queue-driven Lambda scaling. Question number 238. An ECS application performs a read-heavy workload against RDS for MySQL. During traffic peaks, the database read latency metric increases and application responses slow down. Which application change should the developer make? Option A. Increase memory in the ECS task definition. Option B. Add more ECS container instances. Option C. Cache frequently requested query results in Amazon Elastic Cache. Option D. Add DynamoDB read capacity units to the RDS instance. The correct answer is C. Cache frequently requested query results in Amazon Elastic Cache. Here is why. Elastic Cache serves repeated reads from memory and reduces read load and latency on the RDS database during peaks. Why are the other options not correct? A more task memory does not reduce database read work. B. More application instances can increase database pressure. D. RCUs are a DynamoDB capacity unit and do not apply to RDS. Exam tip. Add an application cache when repeated relational database reads cause elevated latency. Question number 239. An application must symmetrically encrypt large files before uploading them to S3. The encryption operation must run inside the application and use a WSKMS to protect the data. Key. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A. Create a KMS HMAC key and use it with the AWS Encryption SDK. Option B. Generate a symmetric data key through KMS and use the AWS Encryption SDK for application-side envelope encryption. Option C. Generate an asymmetric data key pair and encrypt the file with the AWS CLI. Option D. Generate a data key and send the large file to the AWS CLI KMS encrypt operation. The correct answer is B. Generate a symmetric data key through KMS and use the AWS Encryption SDK for application-side envelope encryption. Here is why. The SDK encrypts large data locally with a symmetric data key and protects that data key under KMS, satisfying client-side envelope encryption. Why are the other options not correct? HMAC keys create and verify message authentication codes. They do not encrypt files. C. An asymmetric key pair does not meet the symmetric encryption requirement. KMS encrypt and the AWS CLI are not intended to encrypt large application files directly. Exam tip. Use KMS data keys with the AWS Encryption SDK for client-side encryption of large payloads. Question number 240. A company has an online web application that includes a product catalog. The catalog is stored in an Amazon S3 bucket that is named DOC. Example bucket. The application must be able to list the objects in the S3 bucket and must be able to download objects through an AM policy. Which policy allows minimum access to meet these requirements? 4. Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Allow. Action. S3. List bucket. Resource. ARN. AWS. 33. DOC example bucket. Effect. Allow. Action. 53. Get object. Resource. ARN. AWS. 53. DOC example bucket / Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Allow. Action. S3. List bucket. Resource. ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket. B. Effect. Allow. Action. S3 *. Resource. ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket / Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. Effect. Allow. Action. S3. List bucket. Resource. ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket. E. Effect. Allow. Action frowny face. S3. Get object. S3. Put object. S3. Delete object. 1. Resource. ARN. AWS. 53. DOC example bucket * Version. October 17, 2012. Statement. T. Attacked. TM. Allow. Acleon S3. List buckle. Resource. Arnios. S3. DOC example bucket. B. Effecal. Deny. Action. L. S3. GUL 0 Resource. ARN. AWS. S3. DOC example bucket * The correct answer is A. Allow S3, list bucket on the bucket ARN and S3, get object on the object ARN pattern. Here is why. The application needs exactly 2 permissions. Option A grants only those required actions on the correct bucket level and object level resources, satisfying least privilege. Why are the other options not correct? B. Grants S3 on all objects, including unnecessary write and delete permissions. C. Adds S3. Put object in S3 delete object, which the application does not require. D. Explicitly denies S3. Get object, so the application cannot download objects. Exam tip. S3. List bucket requires the bucket ARN, while S3. Get object requires an object ARN ending with /**. You have completed part 6 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.